Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for your patience today. Welcome back and to our monthly series with the Cannabis Chamber of Commerce. We have a very detailed conversation going on today in regards to the opportunities and challenges in the tri-state area. So to kick this off, we have three speakers that are going to be speaking about the social equity in the tri-state area. We're going to have Michael Schwam, the corporate partner and co-chair of family practice, Dwayne Morris, LLP. He's going to be discussing New York. Rachel White is a CPA, and she's from AB Fine White, LLP. She's going to be discussing Connecticut. And then Marvin Miller will join us, and he is the partner at Kraft Miller and Extras LL on New Jersey. So to get things started, we're going to kick it off first with Michael. Michael, thank you so much for joining us in this conversation.
My pleasure. Great to be here and be able to talk a bit about the developments in New York on cannabis. And I guess the first topic is social equity. As for each of these topics, other than perhaps tax, this could be a 4-hour seminar in of itself. So I will try to summarize in the 5 or so minutes allocated to this section about where New York stands on social equity. So, clearly both from the legislative history, the legislation and the regulations, social equity in New York is of a paramount importance. The guiding principles of the legislation were that at least 50% of all licenses be issued to social equity applicants. That and the statute and regulations are fairly broadly defined to include women, veterans, farmers, disabled persons, minorities, and people or entities, adversely impacted by the war on drugs. And so, the first off in New York, the first category that they granted were conditional cultivation licenses. They went exclusively to farmers in New York who previously had, been granted hemp licenses and specifically, CBD, from hemp, not industrial hemp. There were 200 plus licenses granted to those folks. They're conditional in the sense that, there are limits in terms of the amount that they can grow. It was for essentially a 2-year period, after which they can apply to convert those to a full traditional cannabis license. The requirements were you could do greenhouse or 25,000 square feet greenhouse, 40,000 square feet outdoor, or if you did a mixed, it was, I believe 30,000. They then granted a handful of conditional processing licenses. Again, those went solely to those folks who had previously received hemp processing licenses. And then the next and last license category where licenses have been granted have been to the retail dispensary level. And that is limited solely to individuals or entities adversely affected by the war on drugs. For individuals, you have to have had a New York cannabis conviction, as well as holding, an interest in a business that has been profitable for 2 years. There were, I believe, 190 applicants. They recently granted a total of 36 licenses. I think 29 went to individuals throughout most of the state, and 6 went to nonprofits who are serving that community. There have been some interesting developments in that space. There was a lawsuit filed in upstate New York seeking to enjoin the granting of licenses in 5 New York regions based upon what people in the industry are probably way too familiar with and never heard before, Dormant Commerce Clause, which is a United States constitutional principle where states can't impose unreasonable restraints on interstate commerce. And it just has traditionally been applied in situations where there is a residency requirement attached to some piece of legislation that's not really serving a proper state purpose. And a proper state purpose is not, protecting the economic interests of its residents. We just last week got the next set of proposed regs for most of the license categories, really everything but consumption lounge and delivery. And as with everything else, there is a social equity component of that where those licenses will be granted. I think I'm probably at my 5 minutes. I could go on, but I will turn it over to Rachel, unless there were questions that came in that you want me to answer at this point, or if we're going to hold them to the end.
We will be holding the questions off until the end. We'll bring it up next. Thank you for that, Michael.
Great job, Michael. I'll be reading my notes more than it shows how much you know off the top of your head. So I appreciate that. Okay, so setting the background for Connecticut, June 2012, medical marijuana was legalized in Connecticut. Okay, and recreational use began in July of 2021. They began the application process for licenses for retail and recreational adult around February or March of this year. So I saw a lot of articles. I was kind of doing a little research before our presentation here, and what I saw was a lot of people were expecting recreational licenses to be issued sometime in 2022, and say stores and things like that to be up and running by the end of the year. But my understanding now is that retail sales are expected to begin in early 2023. So everybody's a little disappointed in that it's been a slow start. It's been a really slow start. There's a few agencies that are involved in Connecticut. One of them, the main one, is the Department of Consumer Protection. They manage the license applications, and they also hold the lottery process for the state. There's also the Social Equity Council, which I'll touch on as well, and the fun one, which is the Connecticut Department of Revenue Services, which we all love, taxation, right? We'll get to that. So as I mentioned, the process is mainly a lottery process. First preference is going to go to social equity applicants. And just like New York, 50% of all social equity licenses will be awarded, to social equity applicants. That's the goal. So they have the same concept of the war on drugs as, all states do, as we've seen. And each state kind of has a different way that they're rolling it out. So in Connecticut, there's two main qualifications. One of them is income. And the first part of that is an individual less than 300% or 3 times of the state median household, which is about $240,000. State median income is about 80. And so it's about $240,000 annually. So that's actually not that low of a bar. I've seen in other states where it's much lower than that and harder to qualify based on an income threshold. The second part of that is they have to be a resident of a disproportionately affected area. And there's 2 ways that it's defined in the Public Act. And one of them is there has to be a historical rate for drug-related offenses greater than 1/10, or an unemployment rate greater than 10%. So a lot of this is determined by the Social Equity Council, and it's supposed to be determined on a annual rolling basis, what areas are kind of drawn out and districted for this purpose. So they have a lot of control in that area, and they also hold the lotteries, as I mentioned before. I'm going to touch a little bit on licensing too. It's kind of a mix. You can't really touch on social equity without also touching on some of the license aspects. But, the fees in Connecticut are astronomical. They're $3 million for producers and $1 million for retailers. So the bar is very high there as well. There's a reduced fee of up to 50% for equity joint venture applications where investors agree to partner with the social equity applicant. So basically the incentive is you have one person who may be a legacy operator or has been disproportionately affected by the war on drugs, and then they kind of team up with someone who is a business. Essentially, that's an investor. In reality, we've seen how that happens and how that's rolled out in other states. I could definitely think of, California social equity applicants. They have an investor who holds the control, and so that'll be kind of interesting to see how that goes because, when you have somebody in social equity and they need to find $3 million, funding right now, especially in this current climate, is really tough in cannabis. And you hear people who have licenses who are unable to actually move forward with it, in some of these tri-states because they actually don't have enough funding. So that will be kind of interesting to see how that goes. Let's see what else I have on that topic. So as I mentioned, the Social Equity Council, which is government appointed, has the mission to run the program essentially. And the funds from the adult use cannabis program help communities affected by the war on drugs. And they have a bunch of intended budgets published on their website. The interesting thing is they haven't even met in the last 5 months. I thought that was kind of interesting because with all these, licenses recently being approved and operators coming online, the social equity playing such a big piece in this, I looked at their agenda and they haven't met in 5 months since July 2022. So I thought that was pretty interesting. Part of what they roll out is, workforce development plans. Those are in progress. They educate and train people to meet the needs of the future. They've partnered with a university, and they have, I do like the idea of this university because they do have really good topics such as like supply chain, introduction to the Connecticut supply chain, talks about current cannabis operators, cannabis finance. So I think the intention is good with trying to educate people and try to give them a head start. And we hope that works out well, of course. So an interesting social equity fact is that Connecticut social equity requirements are less rigorous than other states and may even be opportunistic for out-of-state residents. And I'll make my last point here. There's been definitely, there was a recent lawsuit where the issue of control came up with the social equity applicant where they were denied. And there's a lawsuit with against the DCP, the Department of Consumer Protection, and the Social Equity Council. So on the issue of control and social equity. So I think we'll see this play out, over the next upcoming years. And that's all I have. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Rachel. Next up, we're going to bring on Marvin Miller.
Thank you very much. I'm sort of going to be a little bit like Rachel because two things. One, not as good as Michael. I didn't memorize everything, but it is a fairly detailed social equity description, and it also ties in with licensing. And as Rachel just mentioned, you really can't talk about one without the other. So I'll go into a little bit of licensing and cover more of it later. But in New Jersey, the social equity is a basket of items, and it's either a social equity business, which is somebody who lives in an economically disadvantaged area. Get to that in a second. Who has a previous conviction for a cannabis-related offense. Is a diversely owned business. So it's either minority-owned, woman-owned, or disabled veteran. As certified by the Secretary of the Treasury of New Jersey. So you actually have to get a certification from them when you're doing your application. Or you're in an impact zone. In New Jersey, the economically disadvantaged areas cover approximately 17% of the population of New Jersey, and currently is 55 of the 595 zip codes in the state are designated as economically disadvantaged areas, and the impact zones are designated separately. Primarily, it's to target those areas of the state in excess of 100% or 120,000 of population, where there was a past criminal marijuana enterprises contributed to the poverty in the area. So you have sort of those three buckets in social equity, and in the reason why it's sort of important is because in the application process in New Jersey, there are 10 actually different categories of licensing review by the state. So when you put your application in, the state's going to score it based upon whether you're a social equity business, and that is the highest level, and that's the first priority of applications that are reviewed. Then diversely owned businesses, then impact zone businesses, and basically everybody else in the next two categories with multiple subcategories. In the scoring process, you actually are given points for each of the different categories, so that the state can determine who has first priority in the application review process. The social equity, you can have one or more people involved in the social equity designated business. But if it's one individual, you can't have more than $200,000 income from the previous year, or if you're a group, not more than $400,000. And as I mentioned, it's the importance is more in the identifying of where you're going to be in the review process. We currently actually are representing somebody in New Jersey who has received a conditional license for social equity, as well as she met the diversity requirement as well. And so she has a conditional license, and we're now trying to find a partner for her in a place where she can open up her cultivation. I don't know if I want to go into anything further on the social equity. We don't have most of our issues have been settled in the state, in New Jersey, from previous litigation. But I think that's about all I want to talk about on this one. So I guess
Hey, Marvin, one thing I'll add on, apropos of your last point about litigation, there actually now is pending litigation in New Jersey, and I only know about it because we're actually representing the plaintiffs, a plaintiff against the state on the basis of the most recent awards for the, I guess the vertical licenses. There is a challenge to whether or not the state did enough homework and looking behind the MBE, WBE certifications that these companies had, because it appears as if the real control person does not meet that criteria. So
is that the case there? Yeah, is that the case they're going to discuss during the board meeting tomorrow?
The data I don't know, because but it's not 100% settled yet, and there is. I think that one thing that we're going to see in all three of these states is significant litigation based upon scoring systems and how these things, are awarded. I think it's one of the reasons that Connecticut went to a lottery, because then you eliminate that concern. But obviously, based on what Rachel said, it was that hasn't been 100% successful either. And given what's at stake, if you have a deep pocket and you think that you were unfairly not awarded a license, it will continue to sprout litigation, which is good for nobody but the lawyers.
Right. I think you raise an interesting point, Michael, because the experience so far in other jurisdictions, and I think this is what New Jersey was trying to do, was to try to get as much specificity as possible. So it's sort of less touchy-feely, right? It's more evidence-based. And what they have done is and it's a very detailed. I mean, they tell you exactly how you're going to be scored. They tell you exactly what categories you're in. They tell you exactly who we're going to go to first. So it's less open to chance, right? So I guess the question is whether or not that is a sufficient enough approach to withstand any challenges, and we'll find out.
Perfect. Well, let's move on to the next topic. So next up, we're going to be moving the conversation over to licensing, process, structure, and fees in this tri-state region. We're going to kick it off with Michael again. He'll be discussing the New York landscape.
And my memory and my reading and retention ability is not good enough to not look at my notes for this one. Particularly because the New York, the proposed regs came out last week. It's like 270 pages. I haven't yet had the ability to fully read and digest, but there are sort of some key takeaways that I will attempt to address in the next 5 minutes. So there are, let's call them, there are like 8 different license categories. There's, nursery, cultivation, processing, distribution, retail dispensary, microbusiness, co-ops, consumption lounge, and deliver. So maybe I miscounted, but all relatively self-explanatory. I think the big takeaway that we got from the regulations is New York's concept of true party and interest, TPI for obvious reasons. And basically what those rules state, and it was sort of mandated by the New York cannabis legislation, which really follows the New York alcohol model, is, the cannabis industry is broken up into 2 tiers. You have retail, delivery, and consumption lounge. Retail, and then you have sort of the wholesale, which is everything other than that. And you cannot have ownership or interest in more than one tier. So obviously no crossover stock ownership, but it extends to anything that they deem to be, some type of control or influence. So you can't have shelf stocking agreements with the dispensary if you're a brand. If you're a landlord, there are limits in terms of rev share and the like, and so it gets fairly complicated fairly quickly. There are some de minimis exceptions for service providers and ancillary services, but there is, in theory, zero cross ownership. So, if you owned one share of, or 0.1% of a dispensary, you could not have any ownership at the, at a cultivation. This is going to cause particular heartache to the 10 existing registered organizations, which are the medical marijuana providers in New York, who under the legislation had a right to open up 3 dispensaries, 3 adult use dispensaries, and there's 6 medical. If they so choose to open up 3, then they can't provide their own product, right? It'd have to come from somewhere else. And in fact, if they have, if these entities have out of state operations, then that counts too. So, if you're an MSO outside of New York and you happen to be one of the 10 ROs now, you're essentially out of the retail game. So, it's a bit challenging. New York has adopted, license grants will be for 2 years. They will be non-transferable without the written approval of the Cannabis Control Board. I think they've gotten smart looking at, other states. And so they've actually worked in sort of a change of control concept into this. So, if there's a change of majority ownership of the license and that constitutes a transfer, you'll have to deal with that. It looks like if there's a change in the true party an interest, that's not constituting majority ownership, there may be a lesser level of approval. You will be able to change locations, but with certain levels of approval, by the OCM, but you won't have to go up to the full board. Some other sort, they have, for a number of these license categories, created different tiers with different pricing, mainly based on square feet, to address, financial capabilities, license fees, and the like. I guess I should say, the regulations that came out, last week address all the license categories other than delivery and distribution, which will be forthcoming, hopefully soon. But these are proposed regulations. There is a 60-day comment period. The OCM then will, read, consider, put out presumably final regs that will require at least 30 days before they go into effect. So, absolute best case, if, there were no comments and immediately adopted them, you're talking 3 months. Given what's happened in the past, I don't think that's realistic. And so you are looking probably, 4 or 5 months at least. And then they actually then have to go ahead and grant licenses. So, it seems highly unlikely that we will have a full adult use market beyond the test market that we have today, before the second half of next year. Let me just see if there's anything else of major input on the licensing side that I have not yet addressed. EPI. I guess, one thing that they did, I think, address in the correct way, based upon all the concerns about how capital was going to flow in. And if I invested in one license, would I be barred? You will be allowed to own up to 20% interest in as many licenses in the tier that you wish to invest in. So, you could invest in 15 different cultivation facilities if you so choose. I think that creates a business model for, individuals and or funds to create a presence in New York. Based upon the two-party interest rules, I think you're more likely going to see these funds addressing the wholesale and not the retail side of the equation. It will be, if you are a fund and your LPs in your fund have, invested in New York, you're going to have to sort of do some diligence on your own to figure out, where they've invested. Because in theory, an LP in your fund, if they've invested in cultivation in New York, then the fund itself cannot invest in retail. And given the capital demands, if folks are trying to put a lot of capital to work, you are going to, want to probably up in the wholesale tier. And I think part of this was, they're looking at the liquor model. There are a lot of mom and pop liquor stores that are not nearly as capital intensive as brands or manufacturers. I do think that, you are allowed under the the retail license to own up to 3, and then it will tell you if you have 3 profitable, New York dispensaries open, that's a significant business worth, tens, if not $100 million. I mean, you see single unbuilt licenses in other states, going for $8 to $12 million. You only can imagine if it's up and running and making money, which will be the topic of the tax conversation. So it's a question of whether or not you actually can make money, in this day and age in cannabis. They can be real businesses. And so I think, people are going to have to look long and hard in figuring out how they want to decide where to invest. And in our conversations with OCM, I mean, they're sort of, absent a change in the legislation, we're locked into this model. So, people are going to have to adjust to it. I do think there are enough opportunities in New York, given how they've laid this out. The question is how they're going to enforce compliance, and how, an investor, if they're not an individual, is going to be able to figure out, working their way up through the chain, who has invested. Because I can only imagine if I'm a fund and I have an entity investing in my fund, how you work those certifications up the chain to the ultimate individual owners to ensure there is compliance. And in fact, how is OCM in fact going to do that? Because there's no way that at the bottom, I will be able to hand over to them the list of all the investors up the chain. It's just, it's an IR nightmare. And in fact, if I'm an up tier fund, I'm never going to disclose who my investors are to anybody. So we shall see how this all plays out. But at least we're making progress.
That is true. Well, thank you for that, Michael. Next up, we're going to go on to Marvin, who will be discussing New Jersey.
Okay. Actually, I'll pick up where Michael left off on the ownership, and then I'll back into the licenses, because that's usually one of the things people are most interested in. In New Jersey, generally, you cannot sell more than 50% of your equity interests in your entity that has the license during the first 2 years that you're operating the business. If you have a micro license, you can't sell it to somebody who's not a micro license business. And if you have one of the social equity licenses, you have to be able to maintain your social equity status during the first 2 years after giving effect to the transfer. So backing into what the licenses are in New Jersey, we've actually divided it into 8 different categories. You have a recreational use license, a cannabis cultivation license, a manufacturing license, and a wholesale license. The cannabis distributor and the cannabis delivery licenses are separate. The cannabis distributor license is basically, you think of it as a B2B amongst everybody in the cannabis industry. And the cannabis delivery license, think of it as B2C. And then we also have the retailer license, and that's it. The interesting thing about New Jersey is the fee schedule. I guess in most jurisdictions it's like this. In California, it's crazy. The fees are an application issues or expenses are interesting. They range from anywhere from $100 for micro businesses up to $1,600 for annual businesses or for an annual application. There is a further fee on your annual fee, ranging anywhere from $5,000 to $50,000 if you're a cultivator, and that's based upon different tier levels for your square footage of your grow. If you're a manufacturer license, it's going to be anywhere from $20,000 to $30,000. The interesting thing about that particular one is that's based upon the square footage of your building, not the square footage of the part of the building that is being used to manufacture. Also, the retailers have to pay an extra $10,000, and laboratories have to pay an extra $4,000. Oops, forgot to mention there's also a laboratory license. I apologize. And the interesting thing is, though, is I don't know if this is true in the other jurisdictions, but when you pay your first annual fee in the state of New Jersey, you actually get to credit any fees you paid in order to get your license. So all the application fees you paid along the way, because you have to pay a fee for the initial application, have to pay a fee for the for obtaining the license, you have to pay a fee for accepting the license. So all of those fees are creditable against your very first annual fee. And then thereafter, of course, it is sort of what it is. If you change your location, if you change your ownership, if you want to convert to another type of if you want to convert from a micro business to another, want to convert from one business to another, there are various fees averaging between $10,000 and $20,000. So there's also, and I don't know if we're probably going to cover this later, but I'll mention it here. There's also a funding mechanism for the social equity program, a tax. Oh, excuse me, it's not a tax. It's sort of a levy on cultivators that I guess we'll discuss later. That in New Jersey just recently went up from $1, I think, 10 to $1.53 or $1.58, but I guess we'll get some more clarity on that later. That's about all I have.
All right. Thank you for that, Marvin. And next up, we're going to move on over to Rachel. So let's get her on.
Okay. So we're on to Connecticut licensing. Mine's going to be rather brief because I did chat about some of that earlier in the social equity section. But as I mentioned, in February and March of 2022, that's when the recreational license application dates opened. I actually looked on the DCP website this morning just to see if the application periods had reopened, and they have not since then. It's currently closed. So I guess they have a calendar on their Connecticut.gov website for when the application windows will be open. So just kind of keeping an eye on that if you're trying to apply. Again, in the States, it's been off to a slow start. I think every state is actually like that. We definitely see that in New York. I'm a little familiar with New York, and we've seen a slow start there as well. And it's like a lot of false starts too. So people's hopes have gotten high, and a lot of times, the regulators just don't get behind it as quickly as applicants would like them to. So I think we see a lot of that right now. For example, so there's been about fewer than 50 licenses available across manufacturing, transportation, retailers, and delivery services through the lottery process first. The DCP also issued 40 licenses to growers and retailers. So that's not a heck of a lot. It's a smaller state, but 40 licenses is not a lot, considering the whole supply chain. Again, this is a state, just like the other two, that have 8 different types of licenses. Retailer, micro cultivator, delivery service, hybrid retailer, food and beverage, product packager, product manufacturer, and transporter. So let's see. Okay, so first, obviously the preference, like I said, goes to social equity lottery. And then a general lottery is conducted after the conclusion of the social equity. So they are actually getting more preference here. On the topic of licensing, I guess there are some kind of current issues with Social Equity Council. They've remanded about 11 cultivation licenses and reconsidered 6. So I think there's definitely some issues happening with the application process there. And I'm not quite sure what those are, but just kind of is telling to how difficult this process is sometimes and rolling it out. So as I mentioned earlier, there's super high fees for the reduced fees are for the social equity applicants that actually partner in an equity joint venture. So that's one of the key things that I see that's very different, that is, again, kind of forcing the partnership there. That's actually all I have on the issue of licenses.
Thank you so much for that, Rachel. So we have one more topic that we're going to be covering today, then we will open it up to the Q&A. So again, just a reminder, feel free to add those questions into the chat bar or to the Q&A button below. So the last topic is going to be on tax in the tri-state region. Again, we're going to kick it off with Michael again.
Thank you. So I guess we can't discuss taxes first without discussing sort of at the federal level, and I will let one of the accountants dive a little bit more into 280E. But if you're not familiar with the federal tax section 280E and you want to be in this business, you better get acquainted with it. And I will let Kevin or Rachel dive a little more into that when they speak. New York's tax structure, to say is complex would be the understatement of the year. It's I guess there's a 2 or a 3 level tax depending upon how you want to view it. There is the business itself will pay an income tax. The tax rates range between 6.25% and 7.25%. In the alternative, there's a business capital tax or a fixed dollar minimum tax. Whichever sort of comes out the highest. There will be some ability to qualify for reduced or waived taxes if you're a New York manufacturer. We'll see if that actually how that's defined and how that's implemented. On top of that, New York is levying a 13% excise tax, 9% of which goes to the state and 4% which goes to the municipality, which is, and county, split between them. On top of that, there then is a THC tax, which will be a function of the percent of THC per milligram for a flower in the product, ranging from flower, concentrate, or edible. It's 0.005 per milligram for flower, 0.008 per milligram for concentrate, and 0.3 per milligram for edibles. And then on top of that, while the state is generally exempting cannabis products from sales tax because there's this excise tax, New York City can still impose a sales tax of 4.5% on product in the city. So when you add it all up, certainly you're paying, if you're in New York City, 17%, equivalent of sales tax. And then the businesses will be paying obviously tax on top of that. I wasn't clear, the per milligram taxes at the wholesale level. So presumably that's then baked into the product. And so, you're whatever, pick a number, $30 product, the amount of tax on that is going to be fairly significant when you boil it down, which is why a lot of these companies are sort of struggling for cash flow, even if on paper they're, the company could be sold for a lot. A lot of these businesses are not generating, positive cash flow. When Rachel or Kevin talk about 280 at the federal level, New York, has decoupled itself from that. So as a New York business, on the New York tax side, you will not have to worry about that. I guess it's sort of an ancillary issue, right? All the non-cannabis products, whether it's lighters, rolling papers, pipes, et cetera, are tangible personal property and will be taxed, under the current sales tax regime, depending upon in which jurisdiction within New York that it is sold. And like, any other business, you'll have to, get your sales tax number from the New York Department of Taxation and Finance, collect the sales tax, and then pay it over to the state. and do your quarterly filings, as you would selling any other product in the state of New York. That's about all I have on tax. I will turn this over to the two tax experts on the phone, of which I am not one of them.
Perfect. Thank you, Michael. We're going to pass it on over to Kevin. Kevin's going to be speaking on New Jersey.
Yeah, thank you. So Kevin Cassidy for the Director at Citron Cooperman. Thank you for your time. So following on Michael's thing, so for 280E, right, I wasn't in my prepared remarks, but I think it's a very relevant discussion, just making sure everybody's on the same page with 280E. So like Rachel and I, unfortunately, know 280E all too well, but to make sure to put everybody on equal footing for 280E, right, the issue in a nutshell is that companies that are subject to 280E, which is an IRS rule for, talks about the illegal drugs, basically, right? So if anything is a Schedule 1 or Schedule 2 drug, it falls into this category. I won't get involved in all and how it came about. But what it's doing is it's disallowing certain expenses that are typically deductible for tax purposes that are not deductible if you're subject to 280E. So what you get is, so most companies get taxed on when you go through the whole P&L, you come down to income before taxes, and you pay a tax rate, and that's your net income. Companies that are subject to 280E, so cannabis companies, they get taxed on gross profit. Right? So it's revenue less your cost of goods sold, your gross profit. That's what you base your tax on. So it's not, so you can't deduct all your typical SG&A, all those expenses, you can't deduct them. So you find yourself in a position where you could be paying taxes, although you're losing money. So as an example, you make $100, right? Your cost of goods sold is $40. You have a $60 gross profit. You have $80 in all different expenses. You're losing money. Okay. Most companies wouldn't take it, forget about all the other technical stuff, but you wouldn't pay a tax. Cannabis companies, you're paying, in my example, tax on $60. So therefore, companies are really put in a position where, again, you're paying taxes. It's just an added expense. So to Michael's point before about like the value of a company, for EBITDA, so you could be showing a high EBITDA because you'll be adding that back. But again, you're losing money from a cash flow side because you're based on my example. So that's really what a lot of the companies we're seeing these days. That's the issue that they're facing. And as one little antidote, the companies are, because they're cash constrained, companies are unfortunately not paying their taxes. They're using that as a mechanism, really as kind of a loan from the government, which obviously nobody on this call likes. But their companies are being forced into that position sometimes, and we're starting to see that more and more frequently. So that's just a real high overview. I'm happy to take some questions about that at the end, but that's really a high overview for 280E and why it is frustrating to everybody in this space. So going through, for New Jersey a little bit, I'm not going to go through. I don't know the details. I can't spit out the details as rapidly as Michael can. But for New Jersey market, so real quick here. So starting on July 1st, the medicinal purchases for cannabis are exempt from New Jersey sales and use tax, again, starting July 1st. But for New Jersey, so some companies or some states rather, I explained 280E at a broad level. That's so federal is what it is. Some states have taken the position that they're going to decouple from 280E. So they're going to say, okay, yeah, 280E is out there for a federal perspective, but we're decoupling. We're going to allow it, the traditional tax authorities or tax rules rather, for state purposes. So in New Jersey is one of those. So New Jersey is not subjecting from a state perspective to 280E, but again, New Jersey companies are subject to a more federal 280E perspective.
So you're legally required to keep two sets of books.
There you go.
Right. Okay.
So we talked about, we have a retail social equity tax, excise tax fee. There's an optional transfer and user tax and the sales and use tax in New Jersey. The social equity tax fee is based on the receipt of sales of cannabis. The different localities in New Jersey, they are authorized to impose the cannabis transfer and user tax on cannabis establishments in addition to the New Jersey sales tax. The transfer tax is based on, well, I don't want to get into all the details, but it's based on a percentage of the receipts. What else we have here? It's not important. So, and then the thing to mention really here is that cannabis cultivators, right? They're subject to the social equity excise tax. But if they're paying the social equity excise tax, they're exempt from the New Jersey sales and use tax. And that's probably the only. And so Rachel, I know is definitely more of a tax person than I am. But so Rachel, I'm not sure if you have anything. I know you'll talk about Connecticut, but if you have anything to add on New Jersey about New Jersey taxes, please feel free to chime in.
I think that was good. That was great. I guess what we're all learning here, and every week we learn here on this webinar, if you didn't already know, is 280E is federal. So when you prepare your federal income tax return, you look to whether, obviously, we know that 280E applies federally for cannabis. It applies differently to producers versus non-producers. So that's a huge, distinction. Producers can actually capitalize a lot more into cost of goods sold than retailers or folks that, do not essentially change the form of the product. And, so there's definitely some flexibility there, but what we're learning here, looking at each individual state, is do they conform to 280E? In other words, when you prepare the state income tax return, do you have to think about 280E when you do that? And so the bad news for Connecticut is, yes, at least for 2022, I didn't look for 2023, but 2022, Connecticut conforms to 280E. So, just like Michael was talking about New York, 2022, they were conforming to 280E. So you had to watch out for that. But as of 2023, it sounds like they are not. So on a rolling calendar basis, they can decide these things. So we really kind of have to stay on top of it. There's other states like that too. I think Arizona is another state like that. Whereas, you come to California, Colorado, there's definitely a non-conformity to 280E. But you also have to look at whether it's on the individual or corporate basis as well, because there's different treatment at the individual corporate basis. So it's a fun 280E, not even to mention 471C, but we won't talk about that here. Okay, let's see here. So, basically in Connecticut, there's three basic sales type taxes on the retail sale of cannabis, all collected from the consumers at the point of retail. We have the sales tax, which is the normal state sales tax on tangible personal property, which is at 6.35%, with, of course, the resale exemption. So I think we're pretty familiar with, wholesalers are not subject to that sales tax. The thing I do like about Connecticut is they found one point at which to collect all these taxes. So instead of, passing along onto the distributor or a cultivator or any, part of the vertical, they figured out that the retailer is the best place, that's the end point to collect all these taxes. So the second tax is obviously the local and municipal tax, which is 3% of the gross receipts. And of course, that's designated to the town in which it's sold. And then you have more of a privilege tax, which is the THC tax, which is also based on THC content, which could be approximately like 10 to 15% of the sales price. So it really depends. So if you look at the cannabis plant material, 0.00625 milligrams per milligram of total THC, and there's charts you can look at on edibles. It's different, and then on cannabis products, it's different there as well. So you can see the taxes, state and local, as well as the fact that it conforms to 280E. when you're picking which states to land in, think about that. Think about how open they are to those kinds of things. And also when you pick which city you're going to arrive in, another thing to look at is, their local ordinances and how do they define gross receipts? It's a big thing. Every city can define it differently. I think that's all I have on the tax side. Thank you.
All right, perfect. Well, thank you all again. We are going to open it up now to the Q&A. So we did have one question already come through on the chat. It was from Bahid. This person was asking, what does the genetic labs license fall under? If anybody knows.
Know which state he's asking about.
In New Jersey, you actually have a separate license for a laboratory. So there's a separate application, and there's separate rules and regulations in the act, and there's separate there's specific statutory provisions, and then rules and regulations relating to testing laboratories specifically.
Same in New York. It's actually, I guess, technically not within the licensing categories that they've otherwise enumerated, but there is a separate, application. New York actually put out an RFP, to get labs to apply. I think there are 6 issued already, but there is, if you're interested, if you go to the New York RCM website, there is an application and the requirements, et cetera, are set forth there in detail, and it is. It differs from the others because I don't think there was a social equity component to it, and the fees are substantially less because I guess that it's obviously an important part of the supply chain. Although New York did loosen up on a lot of their testing requirements to try to get product flowing.
The one other thing in New Jersey, again, as Michael mentioned, New Jersey is the same. It's a lower application fee, 1-2. It is treated as a top level application. So it goes, if you're putting in an application for a testing lab, it goes to the top of the pile. You don't have to go through all of those other criteria I told you about before. If you have those criteria with you, it'll be helpful. But you go to the head of the list if you're applying for a testing lab.
And with that, I'm assuming that would also fall en route with his other question around the other license, which was the cannabis research license?
I'm not sure. I think that I'm not sure if you're thinking about medical research, and that's going to be an entirely different thing as opposed to just testing if it meets the standards in order to release it for public consumption. I think those are going to be two separate and distinct. Yeah. If you're running a research lab, that's not this laboratory is for testing cannabis before it goes out into the general public.
Yeah, testing and sampling. As far as I know, the only research license that have been granted by the, at the federal level. I think they're now, there used to only be one. I think they're now 3 or 4. And those universities, receive federal approval to purchase and research the plant. But as far as I know, there is no, state level, research licenses out there.
Well, does anybody have any more questions? I know it's after the 3:00 or depending on your time zone time frame. But I did want to just give another chance for any other questions. I do know, and then I also would like to give each of you a moment for any last words. We can kick it off with Michael, if you have any last words or how people can connect with you.
If anyone has any further questions, feel free to reach out to me. You can find me on the Duane Morris website, or you can memorize MD Schwam at DuaneMorris.com. But always happy to talk about the subject. I think you can't end a cannabis 1-hour session without at least everybody looking to their crystal balls and predicting federal outcomes. Now, my personal view is we won't get any comprehensive federal legislation anytime soon. And I would have said until, an hour or two ago, that I didn't even think we would get safe banking in the lame duck. But based upon stuff I've seen today, coming from both sides of the aisle, with Republicans saying that they have enough votes to help pass safe banking, I think there's a chance. The question is, attaching either a standalone or attaching to the defense bill, which will come up, is whether or not there's enough momentum to include that, given everything else that's going to try to get done in a very short lame duck session now that we're into December. I think safe banking would help a lot. Would bring new players into the industry. Would obviously help the lack of banking, credit card processing, and the like, and would help move this industry forward. I think, frankly, that's about all I would expect us to get, in the next X number of years.
Thank you for that. We'll pass it on over to Marvin. Do you have any last words?
Yeah, I just got a couple of things. Each one of the states, and any state that has legalized cannabis, all of the regulatory agencies have public meetings. They also have, their main websites. Most of them are good. Some of them are not, but most of them are good. With all the information that you need to sort of, before you have a conversation with a lawyer or an accountant, or if you want to go to the step further. And they also have updates, emailed updates, so you can sign up for that. The reason why you might want to sign up for the update is because New Jersey, for example, and I mentioned this earlier, they have their meeting tomorrow for the commission, and they've got 15 items on it. 10 of which don't interest me, but one of them is they're going to have a discussion on the consideration of rules proposed for cannabis consumption areas. We've had a couple of clients that have asked about cannabis lounges, so I'm curious whether or not that's going to involve that or not. But plus, also tomorrow they're going to tell us whether or not they're going to approve new conditional licenses or annual licenses. They've already approved 801 licenses in New Jersey since March. So that's just a general education thing to maybe look into it and keep track of. Second thing is, you have to remember that we were only talking about the state here. If you're going into wherever you want to try to do business, you're going to have to also look at your local rules. Zonings are going to be important. The municipalities in New York, for example, they have the right to opt out. In New Jersey, they can be very limiting on how many businesses can operate in their jurisdiction, where they can operate in the jurisdiction. So you have to get the local rules and regulations, and you probably should be very active in the local political scene, because you're going to be you're on a highly regulated business, and if you're in a highly regulated business, you want to make sure that your best buddies are the people that are that could change the law on you at any moment. So that's all I have.
Perfect. Thank you, Marvin. And Rachel, any final thoughts or words?
Just like what Michael said, it's like, stay tuned, because one day it will be one way and then the next day it will be a completely different story. So just stay tuned. I think everybody that we've heard from and we've dealt with, everything is kind of pre-development, pre-operational for the most part. All of this they're just ideas and theories in general of how things are going to operate. It's just such a new market, which is actually very exciting, very opportunistic. So I say, let's ride that wave and enjoy it. And hopefully we can avoid some of the mistakes that were made in some of the more other mature markets. I definitely won't hold my breath, but if we can hope, one can hope. And like you said, Marvin, maybe contribute to the regulation process, get involved. So I'm Rachel Wright with Ethan Wright and 420 CPA. Thank you.
Thank you. And last but not least, Kevin, any final words and how can people connect?
Sure. So to connect is pretty straightforward on the Citron Cooperman website for under the cannabis group, but it's easy email is kcassidy@citroncooperman.com. And I would also encourage everybody to get involved with the different, either on a state level or broader, some of I don't want to say the broad shows, but like say MJ Biz was just I guess it was last or week, 2 weeks ago. I'm losing track of time. Get involved in that. There are a bunch of different state ones. So especially here in the tri-state area, a lot of us go to those, so that's great. Also, the chamber, right? So the chamber is heavily involved in different networking and different events. From my perspective, I think it's great to see the cannabis industry maturing into, lack of a better phrase, a real business for the most part. So you're getting real business issues. Not everybody will succeed, right? It's not your God-given right to make $1 million. Right, just because you want to start a cannabis company. There's going to be winners and losers, and that's life. And I would encourage everybody to reach out to all of us collectively on this call. We're happy to help with any questions.
And there is a tri-state chapter of the Cannabis Chamber of Commerce that we're all involved in on this panel. So come, check out the website. Come join the chapter. Hopefully we'll be having a gathering, in January.
In New York City.
See you all there in New York City. Yes.
Yeah. Well, and then just to bring that all back around, the reason we are here today is because the white paper that you all worked on. And so for those that do want to get access to this white paper, you can go to thecannabischamber.com/white paper. You actually will see the tab right on the top of the menu. And you can get access to this to go more in depth into this information that you learned today from each of our speakers. So thank you.
I will say it's because the white paper was 2 months. The white paper is 2 months old. It's now out of date, but we do our best.
The contact information's on there.
Yeah. We're changing. Always. Well, thank you all again for joining us today for this month's Thought Leadership Series. Stay tuned for the Cannabis Chamber upcoming events. And again, thank you to our speakers. I hope you all have a wonderful day.